Well, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to have John Waterbury on the Northwestern campus. I'm not going to give him the introduction he deserves. I've said in other venues, John and I go back a very long way, and I'm going to sort of do his introduction in reverse order. He's just come from a 10-year stint as president of American University in Beirut, where he did a wonderful job and took that interesting institution in difficult circumstances to an ever higher plane. Prior to being at AUB, John was a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton. He was director at different times of the Center of International Studies, editor of World Politics, and prior to Princeton, John was with American University field staff in Egypt, where he lived for 6 years. And prior to that, John was a professor at the University of Michigan. His writings are many and excellent, starting from early work that I know many of you know. His terrific book, The Commander of the Faithful in Morocco. He wrote widely on Egypt and the Sudan and the hydropolitics of Africa and the Middle East. He's done political economy studies in India, Turkey, Mexico, and Egypt. John has really just contributed so much to the literature in comparative politics and international relations on North Africa and the Middle East, and more generally on political economy. So we're very, very pleased to have John and his wife, Sarah, who here at Northwestern. John's been here before, but not for a while. And I'm going to turn it over to John. He's going to talk on the democracy deficit in the Middle East. And I'm sure there'll be time for a give and take and comments and questions. John.
Thank you, Hank. I'm going to have to do the technical assistance. How do I advance my PowerPoint? Is it, no, that's not going to do it. I just turned it off. What's the, oh, it's down here. Oh, okay.
And you can just use
these arrows? Okay. Ta-da. I knew I shouldn't have done this. There is a parenthesis in the title of this, or is it the Arab world? Because I think in fact there is a democracy deficit. It's been very well documented. It's been measured up and down by all sorts of multivariate analyses. But the deficit is more located in the Arab world than in the Middle East, however we might want to define the Middle East in general. And certainly having a country like Turkey bridging the Middle East and Europe and a functioning democracy makes that regional grouping somewhat problematic. But as I will say in my remarks further on, there is not a single stable democracy, or really even an unstable democracy, other than perhaps Lebanon and Iraq in the Arab world. So, I'm sure some of this will be familiar to you. It certainly should be for those who actually study this subject. But when I was a grad student, we were all reading with considerable enthusiasm the work of Seymour Martin Lipset, and particularly an article he published in 1959 called The Prerequisites of Democracy, as I recall. And he stressed some socioeconomic trends that indeed were underway just about everywhere in the developing world, and it was the spread of literacy accompanied by the development of mass education systems in many of the post-colonial countries of the world, trying to compensate for what was regarded as elite and narrowly based education under colonial auspices. So we had literacy spreading, if not higher education. There was rapid urbanization, and Lipset thought that the urban environment was in itself conducive to democratic practice, that it was harder to nurture that kind of practice in rural and scattered populations, but urban concentrations would help it, and that urbanization generally would be accompanied by the growth of substantial middle classes. And I think there Lipset had in mind as much professional middle classes, highly trained middle classes, as private sector and entrepreneurial middle classes. But either one would be fine, just as long as they were growing and exerting a stronger presence in society. And along with this would be the spread of political awareness through the mass media. And of course, in 1959, television was barely a factor. This was more print media and radio, but with television beginning to exert a certain significance at that time. But again, the notion being that literate, urban, middle-class, professional constituents would also be the consumers and producers of a very vibrant media, print and radio, that would kind of spread awareness of big political issues that concerned citizens would take to heart, and that somehow this would generate greater accountability for political leadership. Well, I just say right at this point, the Middle East has seen a lot of all of this, but it hasn't seen what Lipset thought would be the result. The second literature that I'd like to mention here, and it's really one article again, maybe not so familiar to many of you, but an article published in 1972 by Dankwart Rustow on the transitions to democracy. And it was quite explicitly a friendly critique of Lipset. And Rustow said, what we really have to do is look at initial conditions, because they may be very non-conducive or seemingly incompatible with democracy, but those initial conditions can, under certain circumstances, still lead to democratic outcomes. So rather than looking at socioeconomic trends that Lipset looked at, and Rustow said they're not irrelevant, but they may not be essential to the development of democratic transitions, we should look at other factors. And as I put here, beginnings do not foretell ends, so initial conditions can look quite unpromising. And he cited his own country, Sweden, as evidence of this in the late 19th century. And he said, we should be looking for situations of entrenched political conflict, and anybody working on the Middle East would take heart at that, because God knows we have entrenched political conflict. We have to look at a tipping point where the antagonists in entrenched political conflict finally come to the conclusion, often after long and bloody battles, that winner take all simply isn't an option, that you can't win all the marbles, and so you're going to have to share the marbles. And this is a kind of consciousness that comes to the minds of fundamentally non-democratic actors. They're not looking for compromise, it's just the only option for them. And then subsequent to that realization that we can't win it all, there are incentives to develop rules of the game that protect losers. And that's a very essential part of a democratic transition. And finally, once those rules are developed and one hopes applied, there comes a phase that he called the habituation phase, where a much broader stratum of society begins to get used to the rules and comes to assume that they're going to be applied and maintained over a fairly long period of time. None of this has to happen, but it could happen, said Rustow, and why not look for these kinds of situations? I remember reading this back in 1972 and saying, hey, that's great, you know, because we can't wait for the long haul, or I didn't want to wait for the long haul in the Middle East. And here are some conditions which are rather easily met in many Middle Eastern societies. So maybe there's hope out there. Well, that was 1972. And I'm still kind of waiting for these situations of entrenched political conflict to yield their democratic dividends. So, the Middle East looked promising on both fronts. I mean, you could take Lipset, and we seem to be moving along nice Lipsetian curves. You could take Rustow. We had entrenched conflict and what he called hot family feuds, and yet we didn't get what we wanted. So, who or what is the culprit? And here are some of the factors that have been identified since the middle 70s or late 70s. As major impediments to democratic openings in the Arab world at any rate. The rentier state analysis became quite popular, much in vogue after the big spike in oil prices in 1973 and thereafter. And the notion simply here is that if state systems in the Middle East are able to rely on external rents extracted from the export of petroleum and fossil fuels, they don't have to tax their own citizenry, and therefore you do not develop that kind of linkage and dialogue between state authorities and citizens that direct and indirect taxation builds. The oil exporters simply put the rents into state coffers, they distribute the rents, so you have what is called a distributive state, but you don't have the kind of accountability that we hope develop between taxpayers and their governments. I would simply put as a footnote here, I did some work myself in the late 1990s on taxation in the Arab world, and by and large it showed that Arab countries were not undertaxed, even those that had significant oil revenues. So there was plenty of taxation going on, but the accountability was not emerging. War. Middle East has certainly been afflicted by continuing conflicts of various kinds. The Arab-Israeli is the most well-known, but of course we had the longest war of the 20th century between Iran and Iraq, and there have been local and civil and various kinds of regional tensions with war as possible outcomes throughout the region. And the suggestion here is that in a war situation, it's very hard to move towards democratic practice. And I use a term here that those familiar with Arabic will know, takhween. This is where you simply brand all your opponents as traitors. Takhween is the sort of the form of traitorizing anybody in the political system who expresses opposition to constituted authority. And when you're in a war situation, it's real easy to use that. And it's very hard for the opposition to say, no, we're trying to be constructive. And, oh, no, you're aiding and abetting the enemy. You are causing fissures in the national front. So surely there's something of that at play in the Middle East. Then there are those who emphasize, as Hisham Shatabi, the late Hisham Shatabi at Georgetown, actually wrote a book on this, patriarchy or male dominance, the suppression of women, that patriarchy and male dominance, again, provides a rather inhospitable environment for the emergence of democratic practice, although goodness knows in the West we had lots of both and democracy slowly emerged. I'm sure most of you are aware that the French women did not get the vote until 1946. So this is important, but obviously not in itself a sufficient explanation. Islam, been huge speculation. Is Islam compatible with or not compatible with democracy? The key element in this is usually the conflict between Sharia, the kind of holy law of Islam, and secular law. And there are, of course, most Islamic leaders are uncomfortable with the notion that legislatures actually make law. Only God can make law in this kind of overarching sense. So can you have an elected legislature that actually makes law, or is that flying in the face of a basic tenet of religion. I think there's lots of middle ground between an elected legislature and religious law, but I won't go into that. This is where the one set of explanation seems to derive, seeing as the Middle East or the Arab world is predominantly Muslim, and Islam and its fundamental tenets may pose irreconcilable obstacles to democratic practice. End of story. You're not going to have democracy as long as you have faithful Muslims in that part of the world. And there have been various wrinkles on this, and one particularly interesting article actually came out in 2002 in World Politics by Stephen Fish, called Islam and Authoritarianism, and I'll just read you the last paragraph from that article. It says, at the present time, the evidence shows, so this was multivariate analysis, incidentally, across a wide range of countries. At the present time, the evidence shows that Muslim countries are markedly more authoritarian than non-Muslim societies, even when one controls for other potentially influential factors. And the station of women, more than other factors that predominate in Western thinking about religious systems and politics, links Islam and the democratic deficit. So that was a factor often cited and continues to be cited, and one that one can not dismiss easily. One of my favorites is what I call the wimpy intelligentsia. I just observed it over many, many years in the Arab world, that the intelligentsia, which often in the West had played a kind of lead role in trying to carve out space for universities and just political space in general, and confronted their own political authorities, almost never did that in the Arab world. They were willing to attack distant adversaries, imperialism or whatever. But the sycophancy that I saw, for instance, vis-a-vis Saddam Hussein during his years, from all over the Arab world, was absolutely appalling. I mean, I had Egyptian colleagues who would happily take Saddam's money to go off to conferences in Iraq and then talk about the great progress of the Iraqi revolution and this and that. And I just say, what planet are you guys living on? And this is a real problem. The intelligentsia did not play a role that we saw it play in the West. And a wrinkle on this is what I call the subordinate middle class. And I attribute this partially to the fact that most Arab societies in the 1950s, 60s, really almost up until the present time, were heavily state-dominated. Employment and economic activity was heavily controlled by the state. So your middle class was on payroll. They were on the state payroll either directly or indirectly, and did not have the kind of autonomy that we associate with the middle class in Western societies. And next to finally, I want to emphasize something that I kind of neglected for many years, and that's the fact that those who were unhappy with their political systems did not stand and fight, they left. They came to the United States or went to Canada or Australia or just about anywhere they could, but they did not stay inside the system and try to change it. So some of the best educated, most qualified, and in a way politically active people packed up and left the system and did not pose a major threat to it. The final factor that I need to mention here is simply what I call the Bush effect. And it's important. But the effect of the last 8 years in the Middle East of George Bush and Condoleezza Rice and others espousing democratic transitions has probably set back the process for some indefinite period of time. Anything espoused in the Arab world by George Bush and his administration, and I'm really not casting a value judgment on them, it's simply the facts, has made it extremely difficult for anyone in the region to espouse the same thing. And so Arab moderates who have been arguing, we've seen them in Egypt, we've seen them in several countries, who have been trying to move towards a greater opening in political systems, have now been branded as agents of the United States and of Israel. It's usually, they go together, that there's an Israeli-U.S. project for the Middle East and for the Arab world. Democratization is part of a strategy for the hegemony of Israel and the United States over the region. Therefore, anyone who espouses democracy inside our societies is by definition an agent of Israel and the United States and of George Bush. It's going to take a considerable period of time to overcome that legacy. It's very real, and I don't think it's anywhere near as important in other parts of the developing world. So let me see what happens next on this. Oh yeah, I mentioned the Bush effect, okay. I don't have any good answers on what's going on. I think the way I can sort of get myself out of this is simply to say it's probably all the factors I mentioned in different kinds of combinations. That isn't very satisfactory, I know, but it's the only thing I can come up with. Because if we look at the 7 bullets that I had up there, we look at other parts of the developing world, and these factors are also there, and maybe not quite as significant. But there are other oil exporters in the developing world, for goodness sake, who are generating rents. India and Pakistan have been on the brink of war as long as Israel and the Arab world. South Korea and North Korea, Taiwan and China, and yet we have seen great democratic progress in all those arenas. Patriarchy is certainly not a monopoly of the Arab world or the Muslim world, or it's ubiquitous. Islam, we have had, I would say, very promising democratic transitions in Indonesia. We've seen ups and downs, maybe more downs than ups in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And then there's Turkey. My goodness, Turkey, with some interruptions, has been in a democratic transition since the late 1940s. Incidentally, without any of Lipset's prerequisites operative, as is the case in India. All of the transitions started there in the absence of large, urban, literate middle classes and all those sorts of things. But leave that aside. Turkey, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Malaysia a little bit. Islam doesn't seem to be a major impediment in these areas, and indeed maybe Senegal and a few other West African examples also indicate the same phenomenon. So oil, war, patriarchy, Islam, in and of themselves are not sufficient explanations. They may be part of a more complicated situation that's at work in the Arab world. So we may be reduced to telling individual stories or country stories in the Arab world, and I simply mention a few here that have always interested me and intrigued me. The Sudan, which doesn't get much attention except negative, particularly because of the Darfur tragedy. But the Sudan was one of those countries where dog bites or man bites dog, and we didn't really comment much on it because it's just not a country that gets in the headlines. In 1964, a military regime was essentially overthrown in the Sudan by peaceful civilian demonstrations. In 1985, very much or almost the same thing happened, ending the Numeri regime, which had been in power since 1969. We're back under a military dictatorship, but twice in Sudan's history we had kind of civilian uprisings that said, enough, we don't want you guys anymore. Now, and in both cases, military regimes collapsed. I think Iran holds enormous promise. I'm not an Iranian expert. I only know what I read, and I've been there once, and that was back in 1993, so I can hardly claim expertise on Iran. But when I look at that country, even today, with a very unsavory character running it, what do I see? I see that since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, there has been no military, no significant military political presence in the country, let alone a military government. That, to me, is not so obvious as it may seem to others. I'm rather amazed. Now, here was a country that fought a war for almost 9 years with Iraq, and yet was able to keep the military out of any very strong political arbiter role inside the political system. It has developed, not out of concern for democracy, but almost by chance, it seems to me, a set of institutional checks and balances inside Iran, which are quite powerful. Now, these are, again, they're not democratic institutions, but they mean that power is diffused in Iran rather than concentrated. And it is, after all, a very large, sophisticated country, very diverse, and it's moved along the kind of Lipsetian curve fairly far in the last 30 or 40 years. Iran may be one of the more promising countries for a democratic transition among all those in the Middle East. I've already mentioned Turkey, democracy in a very unlikely place when you consider that the transition began somewhere around 1947, 1948. And we cannot dismiss what's going on in Iraq today. I have to confess I was enormously skeptical back after the U.S. invasion of Iraq that we would see anything like a democratic transition. But there have been a couple of rounds of elections there that have been really remarkable. I don't know if they can be sustained, but something is happening there. And then Palestine. I mean, after all, the election of Hamas was, by all accounts, carried out in free and fair conditions. Lousy result, maybe, but a process that was really quite remarkable. I have, to this day, I may be wrong, and we'll never know because it's a counterfactual, think that it was an enormous error on the part of France and the United States to support the abortion of the elections in 1993, and I think it was 1993, in Algeria, which looked like in their second round they might bring to power the Front for Islamic Salvation, as it was called, and some combination of the secular Algerian establishment with backing from the United States and France just called off the second round of the elections. They never took place. And we then saw Algeria descend into not near civil war, into civil war conditions with huge loss of civilian life. And I'm not sure it's totally under control even today. I think it is regrettable that we didn't give the system a chance. We showed that we didn't have faith in the very process we were espousing, that it's the results that count, not the process, and that isn't what I thought democracy was all about. One or two final remarks here. I think somewhat to my surprise, and this is why I have this last slide, it's not your father's mukhabarat state. Somewhat to my surprise, the police and intelligence structures of the Arab states and some others, and I would include Iran in this, have remained remarkably robust and unrepentant, if you will, in their practices. I thought they had probably become more sophisticated and evolved in certain ways, being as concerned with political control as they ever had been. But frankly, being in Lebanon these past 4 or 5 years and seeing, I think, without much doubt, how Syrian intelligence has operated in that country, they have evolved barely at all beyond the 1950s. Their explosives are much more sophisticated. But that's about it. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, seeing how Mr. Putin and whatever the KGB is called now have operated against their adversaries would indicate that they've maybe gotten to 1960 or 1961. It's very crude stuff. And they are there, and they're quite powerful. And I believe, those of you who know transitions in other areas better than I believe it's usually if you get a fissure or some kind of division within the intelligence police apparatus itself that you get a breakthrough. But if they remain solid, it's really hard to move against them. And in most Arab countries, they've remained very solid. No breakdown in the internal coherence of them. They, of course, turn out to be monsters in a way, because if a leader decides that he wants to shift course, it's very hard to do. Saddam, in a way, was a prisoner of the very apparatus he created, as is Bashar al-Assad. He's inherited his father's police apparatus. They're quite coherent. They have an agenda, and it's going to be very hard for him, just because he's president, to change that agenda. There's high risk in his doing so. So there's this variable of the police apparatus, but again, it's not unique to the Arab world. It's quite common phenomenon in many developing countries, but it has not moved with the times, except in technology. But we have seen little changes. The mukhabarat has been muzzled to a certain degree. It keeps a lower profile. In some instances, it may not be getting the same flow of resources that it had in the past. And I go along to a certain extent with some of the propositions that Tom Friedman has put out, that, and what's our young friend here, Brian Edwards, has talked about. He calls it the digital revolution, but it's all the instruments available to us on the World Wide Web that allow political communication to go on in ways that are very, very difficult to control. And it allows some exposure and shaming of the police apparatus and the regimes that is very hard to counter. We haven't seen a major weakening or erosion of power because of the digital revolution, but it is a factor of I think huge potential in the Middle East. Last year, I think it was, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, a number of really ugly incidents were filmed in Egypt or photographed with people just holding up their cell phones and clicking pictures. These were then on the internet and on blogs literally within minutes or hours. These involve things like Islamic thugs beating up covered women. I mean, these weren't women who were wandering around exposed in the streets of Cairo. These were women in hijab. They were beaten up on the streets, just attacked by guys. And people were taking pictures of it, putting it on the internet. There was a bus driver who as I recall, got involved in some kind of political demonstration. It might have been Mahal al-Kubra, where textile workers were on strike. He was dragged out of the bus and beaten by the police right in the street. It's all filmed, out for everybody to see in Egypt, outside Egypt. It's hard for me to think that this doesn't have some kind of impact. When I first started going to Egypt in the 1950s, you'd have to pick it up from stories that people would tell. I remember being there in 1961 when the United Arab Republic broke up. It really doesn't matter what the incident was, but there were huge student demonstrations at the University of Cairo in support of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and denouncing the Syrians who had pulled out of this union. Well, the rules stated that students at Cairo University are not allowed to demonstrate, even in favor of their political leadership. So they arrested all of them. And some of them were students that I had gotten to know. And when they finally were released, I got individual stories, right, of what happened to me when I was in police detention and what they did. They were arrested for 6 to 7 weeks, and some of it was pretty ugly. But that's the way you would hear, and you didn't know how widespread it was, and is this guy telling the truth, et cetera. So it was just stories, and you couldn't do too much with them. But now you're getting, real events filmed and then spread immediately through the media. It's a very different kind of atmosphere, and I think it has put the mukhabarat, the police, somewhat on the back foot in many of these societies. So those are little glimmers of hope. I think things are moving very slowly, glacially, in the right direction, and unfortunately, I think we may have to sort of live down the recent years of the Bush effect in the Middle East before we see these steps slowly resuming in several Arab states. Sorry I took so long on that, but I will come to a halt there and certainly open this up to any questions from the floor that you might want to send my way. Yeah.
Well, I could kick us off. Not that I have a solution on it, but it seems to me that on your list of possible causal factors that have contributed to a democratic deficit, it seems to me that your Algerian story pointed to another one, which is the U.S. lack of support for democratic developments, right? That we supported Mubarak, we opposed Hussein, but when it came to choosing between Iraq and Iran, we basically tacitly supported that. We liked Saudi Arabia as a faithful ally. So, to what extent that's another causal factor that we, certainly during the Cold War, maybe lost some opportunities there that changed the social conditions on the ground that are now haunting us as we would like to see some change. So I wondered if that even complicates the picture even more, i.e. the lack of support from the external environment for democratic development there, changing social conditions on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I can only speculate on it. And part of this is that my chronology may be off, but looking outside the region at some transitions that occurred in highly authoritarian systems that the United States had backed very strongly, and then changed position. I would like to know more. Was it the end of the Cold War that allowed us to do that? And I'm thinking of Chile. I'm thinking of Indonesia, Philippines. Was our rather staunch backing of our sons of bitches, as they were known in those days, simply contingent on our confrontation with the Soviet Union? And once that was over, we no longer had a stake in these autocrats, or was something else at play? Because we never backed away in the Middle East, you're absolutely right. And leadership in the Middle East has been able to play on our fears of terrorism, Islamic militancy, and maybe implicit or explicit threats to the existence of Israel that simply weren't relevant or active in other areas where we had supported autocratic regimes during the Cold War. When did we, I mean, it was under Reagan, as I recall, that we began to back away from some of our former allies. But was it prior to 1989? My chronology isn't all that good on Pinochet and Suharto in particular, and Marcos in the Philippines. But sometime in the 1980s, we kind of said, you're on your own, guys, and they didn't last very long. Yeah.
If you were to draw your own list of ingredients, thank you. If you were to draw your own list of ingredients, components necessary to bring about a change today, what bullet points would you include?
That's, I started this by saying two two explanations in which I had some hope have rather miserably failed. I don't think I can give an academic answer to that. And I've talked to Turkish friends on what happened in the late 1940s in Turkey. And because there was no, as I say, no Lipsetian prerequisites operative there, there hadn't been any entrenched political conflicts such as what Rustow talked about in Sweden in the late 19th century, or what we see in Lebanon, or any, and none of those things seemed to apply, and yet this transition began. And it was led not by Kemal Ataturk, who had died in 1938 or thereabout, but by his successor, his Dauphin, Ismet İnönü, another military guy, one of his generals in the founding of the Republic. Why did İnönü? It seemed to me that this was very dependent on İnönü. That without him, it need not have happened. There was nothing structural going on here. And what was driving him? And I don't think Turks are agreed on this. He was, of course, very frightened of the Soviet Union, which was breathing down Turkey's neck after 1945 and led to the Truman Doctrine to sort of give a U.S. shield to Greece and Turkey in particular, and a little bit to Iran in the face of a outwardly aggressive Soviet Union. So İnönü is saying, my God, the Soviet Union is my main concern. And there's some evidence that he thought that by opening up the Turkish political system, and the party that emerged was called the Democrat Party, interesting only because the existing party were the Republicans. So he had created a system in which the two parties were the Democrats and the Republicans. And some people said, well, yeah, he wanted the Americans to say, hey, good, look, Turkey's just like us. Of course, we were at that point in full John Foster Dulles mode of building alliances with anybody at hand without any political preconditions at all. I can't see that the Turks would have thought Washington would write them off if they didn't have democratic practice. But there is this notion that İnönü wanted to sell Turkey to a skeptical United States, and that by opening up the political system, he would appeal to our better values. I think in hindsight, we could say it was probably irrelevant. I mean, he could have reestablished the caliphate, and we would have backed Turkey to the hilt. But, who knows? So in answer to your question, blind, dumb luck may be the only bullet I can offer up at this point. Yeah, I've forgotten your name, but...
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the possibility of a rapprochement between the United States and Iran, and specifically for your views on how you think this could affect Hezbollah, specifically, and in general, the kind of shifts in alliances and balance of power in the region.
Well, I think there have been opportunities, and we've all read about them in the press over many years, to at least have normal relations with Iran. And we all heard that, I guess, around 2005 or 3 or some, there was the so-called grand bargain apparently put on the table by the Iranians, and the Bush administration walked away. I don't know anything about that, and I'm not quite sure what was on the table. If that kind of rapprochement were possible, and I think it probably is at least theoretically possible, it would be devastating for Hezbollah. I think it would be absolutely devastating for Hezbollah. And I'm sure Hassan Nasrallah and his people are thinking about it long and hard, because the Iranians, I think throughout their history, have a well-deserved reputation for a combination of almost unfettered pragmatism and fierce ideological stances, and they seem to be able to combine both. But it makes them very unpredictable, and if they're unpredictable for us, they're also unpredictable for Hezbollah. And they know this. So I don't think Hezbollah takes Iran for granted at all, and Hassan Nasrallah is far too smart to do that. So what their plan B or C or D is, I don't know, but I'm sure they've got plan B or C or D. But as Hezbollah operates today, a deal, an entente between Iran and the United States would be devastating for them, unless the United States didn't put that issue as part of the deal, which of course Iran would love not to have it part of the deal, just as Syria would love to have Hezbollah out of negotiations with Israel. You know, I assume that in a bargaining situation, Iran will say, no, I mean, Hezbollah, we have no control over Hezbollah, so what are you talking to us about? I mean, they're an independent force inside Lebanon with great support, and they raise their own money, and nah, nah, nah. So I'm sorry, you know, and Syria will say, I'm sure they will say if these talks go on, Hezbollah in certain circumstances is irrelevant, because what will remove the threat of Hezbollah is an overall peace between you, Israel, and your Arab neighbors. That includes us, so let's get on with it, but it also includes Palestine. And once you have peace with us and peace with Palestine, Hezbollah ceases to have relevance for you, Israel. It won't have any cause that it can exploit. So it's not on the table. But let me go back. What is the substance of a deal between Iran and the United States? What do we think Iran really wants from us? Is the threat of either direct or indirect efforts to overthrow this regime, do they think those threats are credible, powerful, and sustainable? And if we took them away and said, we recognize you and we pledge we will not attack you or try to destabilize your regime, that's it? I mean, and you in turn become a responsible actor in the Gulf and do not threaten your neighbors and cease support, well, as I say, they'll try to keep that off, cease support for Hezbollah. Is that the deal with something on their nuclear capacity? Would they give all that up for a pledge from the United States that we respect your sovereignty, we respect your regime, we have no intent to try to change the Islamic Republic or the Islamic nature of the regime? Would that do it? I'm kind of skeptical. Yeah.
You mentioned that Islam is a problem, perhaps a problem with establishing democracy in the Middle East. My question specifically about Egypt and Syria. Both of them have a minority of Christian population. Do you find in your own observation and research that in Christian communities, democracy is thriving better, or would have been thriving better, should they have a chance of being more politically active in those countries?
I would have to confess that I've never looked at that question specifically. The two Christian communities I'm most familiar with are the Coptic community of Egypt and the various Lebanese Christian confessions. I'm only indirectly familiar with the Iraqi Christians, Syrian Christians, you know, other than Armenians to a degree in Syria. So I've never looked inside to see what that looks like. I don't want to venture an answer for Egypt, but I can tell you what my impressions are in Lebanon. There is no greater commitment or proclivity to democratic practice among Christians than there are among Shiites or Sunnis. They tend to share the same political culture, if you will, and it's very much the big chief leadership. You know, all the confessional groups have these kingpins, which tend to be inherited from generation to generation, and at least for public purposes, they pay great obeisance and homage to their leaders. It's a very non-democratic kind of thing. Leadership is inherited. It's not a process of internal debate and selection. And there's an added factor. It doesn't cut across all, or there isn't full consensus on this among Christians. But I've had a number of Lebanese Christians say to me kind of quietly and not for public consumption, you know, we're not totally unhappy with having a very strong Syrian presence here in Lebanon, because without it, we're face to face with the Sunnis and the Shia. And at least in Damascus, we have a secular Arab regime, itself a minority regime, that will not allow us to be overrun or totally dominated by the other religious sects. So if you asked us to choose between a fully sovereign, wide-open democratic Lebanon and a Lebanon under indirect tutelage from Syria, we'd probably go with the indirect tutelage. Hank?
I want to come back to Ellie's question of what would be your points to try to create or get away from this democratic deficit. And I want to raise our sights for a moment beyond the Middle East, because of course what you call the Lipsetian variables were not aimed at the Middle East at all. They were general, and to some extent that was true of the Rostowian, the ones that he worked more on Turkey and the Middle East. So we have another contemporary debate which is going on about what's the chicken and what's the egg relationship, and where people say, well, look at China. You have to liberalize your economy, which is what the Chinese say about themselves, before you liberalize all your polity. And the Chinese go back and look at the breakdown of the Soviet Union and say, look at that. That's a mistake to try to let the rules go free on the politics before you've created the economic and social conditions. So, I mean, this debate, which is, and you can divide up your different list between social economic prerequisites and political rules. And I think that debate is a historical debate about the origins of democracy in the West and Europe and the United States. And the reason there's no clarity, I think, historically on that debate is there's no simple cause and effect relationships. They're complicated relationships, and they differ from place to place or from epoch to epoch. We need time effects as well as the interrelationships. I mean, I think what time and history you're cutting through with regard to international economies and big power relationships all matter in this complicated equation. So, but if I have to pick my list, I pick political rules because you can change political rules, whether the change sticks and whether they're sometimes changed by individuals who have certain biases, whether they stick gets you into the social conditions again, or somebody else tries to rechange them. But they're more easily changed than long-term secular trends of society, urbanization, demography, which you didn't mention at all. And I would put demography on that list as to what happens when you have population imbalances, whether it's gender imbalances, or when you have an age structure of the population which bulges before you can employ them all. I mean, all these things we all know are cooking around. Now, having thrown that out, I also want to suggest that I want to come back to your Bush effect. I don't doubt the way that the Bush administration is seen in the Middle East and a lot of other places. But I would say that, at least for a period of time, the president himself, and maybe his Secretary of State, took seriously what they were saying about democracy. And you can even see it in Egypt. After a long period of letting these guys do whatever they pleased, they started weighing in when you stick Saad Ibrahim in the Huzgau. They made the noises that this regime should evolve. They didn't stick with it all that long because they went back to the old politics of having to do business, and they're afraid of where it will go sometimes. But I think there was a case where the United States did try to intervene modestly, and I would say even the intervention in Iraq had something to do with these people thinking the Middle East would be a better place without Saddam not just because he may or may not have had weapons of mass destruction, but because you could try to create, much tougher than they ever thought, a democratic regime in a core Arab state, and it would radiate out. And they even thought it would radiate out into Israeli-Arab relations. So that's the old saw we saw in Desert Storm, and we saw it again in the invasion of Iraq more recently. The road to Jerusalem runs through Baghdad. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of ways we could try to come to grips with this question. Nobody would have a definitive answer to it because there is no definitive answer. If we knew the answer by now, if it were simple, we're not so stupid, we would have a better idea. But history gives us too much complexity. Society gives us too much complexity to be able to answer this with anything much more than a list of these things and some tentative ideas about how they work out in history at different times.
Well, as I said, I'm not passing a value judgment of my own on Bush, and I think Bush and Condoleezza Rice and many others did sincerely believe and actually had some reason for hope around 2004, 2005 that they were going to get a kind of ripple effect or domino effect. We had the Iraqi elections were quite remarkable. I was astounded, quite frankly, that they were able to pull them off in the conditions they did. We had the events in Lebanon of the spring of 2005 when the Syrians were essentially forced out, followed by legislative elections. Not quite so astounding in Lebanon, seeing as that had happened many times over in past decades. And then the Palestinian elections, which had lousy results, but a very good process. So, there was evidence at that point that things were moving in the right direction, and I would have to say, had it not been for the war in July and August 2006, who knows where that might have gone? Had those gains, other than Hamas, I don't know how the Bush administration would have dealt or not dealt with Hamas in the remaining months of that administration. Had the war with Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, and that happened in the summer of 2006. But that really, I think, sort of sealed the fate of the credibility of the Bush administration, the war. So whatever successes had been registered in Iraq and in Lebanon were kind of lost at that point. And I frankly had never seen anger quite so deep in all the years I've been in the Arab world expressed towards the United States, not so much by our predictable enemies, but by our friends. I mean, they just felt totally screwed. And these are, the people who probably went to Northwestern, or, they were people who identify very strongly with the West and with the United States, and they said, that's it. So even they said, you expect us now to advocate democracy? It's too dangerous. I mean, look what you've created here. Anyhow, that's what I was talking about. Things just went badly wrong after 2006, and they haven't fully reversed themselves. I think I said at a certain point I wanted to mention a benefit of the Bush effect, and it's this. All of the Western press keeps warning us that our expectations of the Obama administration may be set way too high, and the poor guy can't possibly deliver on these expectations. Well, the good part of the Bush effect is that expectations in the Middle East are very low. They're very low. Not much is being expected of him at all. And if he delivers anything, he'll be almost a hero. So a little progress here and there will make him look very good.
I was wondering if you thought that the popularization, or the expansion of air travel and just the entire growth of the airline industry in sort of connecting to that, the growth of the internet and sort of exit in a more existential way, has sort of damaged the ability to see a transition, democratic transition like we've seen before ever again. Just the ability that people can now leave a lot easier than they've ever been able to in the past. Whether it be physically or just sort of escaping the control of their government via the internet. So I was wondering what you thought of the relative importance of exit now, in 21st century.
Yeah, definitely, it's easier. It has to be. That has to be a factor. Some of the big political exits, though, have been made under extremely difficult circumstances. Iranian exiles after the Islamic Revolution in 1979 often had to walk out or be smuggled out, even if they were rich. You couldn't just go to the airport in Tehran and get on a flight. They were being watched. The new regime was sort of drawing up its list of enemies of the revolution. So it was not an easy trip out. And these were the Iranians, many of whom wound up in Los Angeles and elsewhere, and had bank accounts somewhere, but they didn't really help them in the physical sense when they felt in danger. But in general, I think you're right. Exit is quite easy. And there's been a lot of speculation on another kind of exit, which is capital. Again, if a private middle class is supposed to play a role for opening up political systems in a world financial setting where you can move your capital very easily, a lot of people say, that's it. I'm going to liquidate my investments here and relocate somewhere else. And so that kind of leverage, where you use your wealth in a kind of proactive manner inside a political system, may be lost as well. The other side of that, of course, is that resources that were available to the economy are no longer available, and that affects employment and economic growth, and that ultimately may lead to shaking and eroding the power of the regime. I mean, we've all seen the speculation on how bad the economic situation is or is not inside Iran. Again, I don't have any inside information, but we all hear that Ahmadinejad is a terrible economic manager, and it's beginning to erode his claims to power, and he may not do so well in the elections. We hear the same thing about Syria, although I've got a little more information there, and I'm skeptical that the economic situation is as bad as people claim, mainly because there's a lot of Turkish capital coming into Syria. I saw something in the New York Times today which was kind of interesting. I mean, I knew it, but the way it was phrased was why Iran has so much leverage inside Iraq, and one of the points was that it's Iraq's second largest trading partner. Well, who's number one? Turkey. The Turks are alive and well in this area, and they're moving capital in. And I don't know about it. I don't know about Iran, but I think Syria is not quite on the ropes economically. There's a lot of investment coming in, and it's a promising market. Anyhow, I think your point is well taken. Exit is relatively quite easy these days. Yes.
But it also could be the case that return is easier and easier. If we look at the case of India, certainly the internet and many other things have helped Indians keep in touch with what's going on inside India after they leave. So that there's an enormous amount of commerce back and forth between the emigre community in the United States and India itself. And so if those rules you talk about go in the right direction, it becomes very much easier for people to send their capital back into the country they've left and to migrate back in there and to exercise a liberalizing influence.
Yeah. It's certainly true, and the flows are quite astounding. I don't think the Lebanese economy could in any way survive without the huge remittance flow that comes back to it every year from the Lebanese diaspora. It's on the order of $6 billion, and this is in a country of about 4 million people, so it's huge. But it's had no political implications that I can make out. I wish it did. I wish the people who are sending the money back, of course, these are remitted to families, but they come through the banking system, and so in a way they become part of the monetary system of Lebanon. There's no quid pro quo for it. it's coming back to build a house or send a kid to university or pay for your Aunt Julie's operation or whatever. In aggregate, it's huge, but its political effect, as near as I can make out, is almost nothing. But again, we might have to look at individual countries and stories to see how this works out. I don't think this is necessarily unhealthy. I think in the 21st century, we're going to see people who have multiple homes, almost multiple domiciles and nationalities. They're going to have plans A, B, and C. And they're going to operate in more than one political arena at the same time. I'm curious, when you see, and India, I think, is doing the same thing, but China pulling back so many of its highly educated professionals because they're in a booming economy and there's tremendous opportunities. Is that going to have any political impact? The Middle East has been an exporter. Very little re-importation so far. Although my university in Lebanon has been very successful in bringing back professionals. But China and India is beginning to, I think, attract some of the Indian diaspora because in relative terms you can live well and have a good life and be in your own culture. Will this have any political implications India we don't have to worry too much, I hope. Seems to have a pretty vibrant democratic system, but will this have any impact on China and China's political system as these people become more integrated into the professional and academic life of the country? Yeah.
On most of the literature I've read of democratic transitions and consolidation, a precursor always seems to be the acknowledgement of a somewhat stable state. And I guess tangent to President Benen's mention of demography, what do you think the impact of dismantling of the Ottoman Empire post-World War I would have on this, the effects today, especially in Middle Eastern nations, particularly Iraq with the kind of tripartite division? Like, what do you think that how the states exist today affect democratic transitions and consolidations?
Is this a national identity issue that you're suggesting, or
I suppose
that these are artificial somehow, or states?
Right, or in Iraq, how there's the thought of possibility of a de facto Kurdish state in the north, just the illegitimacy with the members who are supposed to belong to the state.
Well, we've certainly seen challenges to national identity in quite healthy democracies. I mean, Canada still wrestles around with its French language populations, and are they going to have quasi-autonomy, full autonomy, no autonomy, and it tends to go up and down, and I don't think the issue has been resolved, and of course Spain has been wrestling with issues like that, and yet has, since the fall of Franco, been a reasonably successful democracy. So I don't, this makes it difficult, but it doesn't make it impossible at all. And I thought your question might be leading to something that many older Middle Easterners say. We're not real states. We're colonial creations out of a dismembered empire, and there's no real roots or feelings to this. And everything I have seen in my own experience in the Middle East, I think, tends to refute that. Yes, these were probably artificial lines in the sand, if you will, at some point. But we're, by Middle East demographic standards, 6, 7, 8 generations away from the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. And as Henry Bienen pointed out, given the kind of demographic change in the Middle East, 40%, 50% of these Middle Easterners today are under the age of 20. These are real countries for them. These are real countries. They may not like them, but they're real, and it's where their great-grandparents and great-great-parents lived, in Iraq or Syria or Lebanon. And they're not artificial. As I say, it may not be very positive identity, and one may not be wildly proud of one's country, but it is the reality, and it's what they know, and I think they're rather accepting of it. The last elections in Iraq seem to say most Iraqis who went to the polls were uncomfortable with the dismemberment of the country. Those candidates who ran the most strenuously on kind of sub-identity labels didn't do very well. It seemed like a kind of vote for holding Iraq together. I have always been struck in Lebanon. Syria says Lebanon is this artificial creation that the French carved out of Syria in 1921. When the national anthem is played in Lebanon, everybody jumps to their feet and sings like lunatics. I mean, it's amazing. Frankly, I've gone to Syria and heard the Syrian national anthem played, and nobody even stands up. I don't think that means Syrians aren't proud of their nation. It's something else going on there. But the Lebanese national anthem just gets them right in the heart, And then they'll tell you, yeah, well, we were carved out of the Ottoman Empire and it doesn't count. Well, I mean, that's not what their body language tells me. There's some real national pride. A country like Egypt, no problem. I mean, if there's any country in the world that is sure of itself in terms of its national identity, it's Egypt. So I don't think that's necessarily going to be an impediment. The Kurdish issue is extraordinarily important. I think in just kind of realpolitik terms, unless the Kurds of Iraq have a major power sponsor and there's only one candidate, and that's the United States, they better look for accommodation within Iraq, because they don't have a single friend in the region, other than Israel maybe. But the Israelis can't, at the end of the day, save them. Turkey, Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia. I mean, there isn't a single country, even those more distant. I mean, the Egyptians aren't going to support the Kurdish claims to independence. The Jordanians aren't. And for the Turks, the Iranians, and the Syrians, and for the Saudis, who have a vested interest in a unified Iraq, the Kurds are nothing but a problem and a threat. So I think they got to reach accommodation, or they've got to sell the United States, and it would be a very contingent sale, and if I were a Kurd, I wouldn't believe I'd ever made the sale, even if some administration said, yeah, we're going to back you. Our track record with the Kurds is not pretty. We sell them when it's convenient. So I think they got a deal. They got a deal, and I think the Turks are pressuring Malki along those lines. So the Kurds are exceptional, but at the end of the day, they're not in a position to really exert their claims.
Maybe we could take one more question, and then after that, I hope you can all join me for a wine and cheese reception on the side. So, one more question to wrap things up.
Yeah.
Well, just to return to this matter of the reemergence of democracy in Iran, it's of course it's a democracy of a special kind. And in conversations I've had, one with, of course, everybody talks about the betrayal of the Mossadegh regime and everything, but we have to remember that was a secular regime. Therefore, the current Islamic Republic, it's complex for them. What they bring up is the 1905 Constitution, which, of course, clerics had a hand in drafting, and took into account the religious identity of the country and everything. And I was wondering if maybe you could say a bit more about your thoughts about this peculiar phenomenon of democracy in Iran, with, of course, the shadow government and the rest being there, but yet the fact that this is going on there. Under Khomeini, one really couldn't talk about the democratic situation, but post-Khomeini, one can.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, other than that you're alluding to several major events in a rather long history of what I see as a promising struggle for some kind of pluralist system in Iran. And it goes back to 1905 and maybe even a little bit before that, because 1905 was like a culmination of a movement. It aborts with the Pahlavis coming to power. I mean, Reza Shah probably had an option that any military leader has to kind of define his own regime. And I've been told he was quite admirative of Kemal Ataturk and said, maybe I'll just be the Ataturk of Iran. And he could have plowed along a Republican secularist path. But then folks said, that's not going to wash very well here in Iran because of the peculiarities of the Shiite establishment and the mullahs. They're much more powerful than anything in Turkey. So maybe you better accommodate them. And he said, okay, so I'll be a Shah. It's like, I could be Ataturk, I can be a Shah. But these movements that came in the pre-First World War period were chopped off and aborted, and I guess resumed again under Mossadegh in the early 50s. But there is a long history there that Iranians seem to remember, and which again leads me to think there's considerable promise in Iran, particularly given the way political authority is somewhat fragmented inside the country today. So I don't think I answered your question, but it did give me a chance to talk about that kind of long tradition of struggle that the Iranians can boast of.